On December 7, 1941, Navy sailor Doris Miller was below deck on the USS West Virginia sorting laundry when he heard the ship's general alarm suddenly go off. Though Miller was a black man and thus relegated to being a mess attendant and cook, he leapt into action as Japanese planes roared above the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That day, the ship's mess attendant would become one of its heroes. As bombs fell around him, Miller quickly made his way to the upper decks and took in the chaotic scene. Screams and smoke filled the air. Planes buzzed low, red dots on their sides identifying them as Japanese aircraft. And Miller, who was not technically allowed to fire the ship's guns because of his race, knew what he had to do and took up the controls of the nearest machine gun. As torpedoes exploded around him, Miller shot at the Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition. Though initially referred to in the aftermath as an unnamed Negro, Doris Miller's story quickly spread. He became a hero in the black press, and the U.S. Navy awarded him the Navy Cross, although Congress balked at giving him the Medal of Honor. Many have since credited Miller with expanding opportunities for black Americans in the armed forces, and the poet Langston Hughes even wrote, "When Dory Miller took gun in hand, Jim Crow started his last stand." This is the story of Doris Miller's life, heroism, and enduring mark on American history. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga. Today, we're exploring the incredible true story of Doris Miller, the black man who became a hero at Pearl Harbor. Long before he became a hero at Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller was just a boy growing up in Waco, Texas. Some sources state that he was named for an aunt, others claim he was named for the midwife who delivered him, though his mother also later admitted she'd wanted a daughter after having 2 sons. The son of a sharecropper, Miller spent most of his childhood working on the family farm. In high school, he shot up to 6'3" and had a successful stint as a fullback on the football team. But as the Great Depression made life for his family difficult in the 1930s, Miller dropped out of school and started to look for a job. Miller worked as a cook and, because of his skill as a marksman, briefly thought about becoming a taxidermist. He also tried to enlist in both the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Army, both of which turned him down because he was just 17 and his parents refused to sign a waiver. In 1939, he was finally able to find steady work with the U.S. Navy as a mess steward. At that point, the Navy was strictly segregated, because the logic of the day suggested that segregation was in the best interest of ship efficiency. Black men like Miller could only work as mess attendants and cooks. They were not allowed to fire or practice firing with the ship's weapons, and their responsibility during battle was only to help load ammunition. As one of Miller's brothers later noted, quote, "It was tough for Negroes in the services at that time. Because there were not any tests, it was hard to advance," unquote. After completing his training in Norfolk, Virginia, Miller briefly served on the USS Pyro before being transferred to the USS West Virginia. Along the way, he had the opportunity to attend gunnery school, despite the fact he would not be allowed to use what he learned there in battle, and meanwhile became the USS West Virginia's heavyweight boxing champion. As a mess attendant second class, Miller had a variety of duties aboard the vessel, all of which forced him to serve and cater to his white superiors. He polished the sailors' shoes, did their laundry, made their beds, served their meals, and cleared the tables. But on December 7, 1941, the 22-year-old from Texas would prove that he was capable of much more. December 7, 1941, the day that President Franklin Roosevelt promised would live in infamy, started out like any other for Doris Miller. Below deck on the USS West Virginia, he tended to his laundry duties and prepared for the day ahead. At around 8 a.m., however, Japanese planes arrived in Pearl Harbor, and the surprise attack that would catapult the United States into World War II suddenly began. One of Miller's fellow sailors, who was standing on the ship's bridge at the time, later recalled that, quote, "I could see the planes headed toward the ship. I could see that they were Japanese, and watched the torpedoes drop from the aircraft headed for the USS West Virginia. I felt 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs hit the ship. You could hear the tremendous explosions, feel the vibration in the metal throughout the ship, and see the fire," unquote. As torpedoes slammed into the side of the USS West Virginia, Miller made his way to his battle station, where his job was simply to handle ammunition. But the attack had severely damaged the magazine, so Miller made his way to the quarterdeck, the stern section of the upper deck, instead. There, he and several others helped move a number of the injured men before Miller accompanied some officers to the bridge to find the ship's wounded captain. One of the officers later said in his report, quote, "I had brought a colored mess attendant with me, a very powerfully built individual, having in mind he might pick up the captain and carry him below," unquote. After they'd moved the captain, Lieutenant Frederick H. White, who was one of the only men on the ship bigger than Miller, noticed 2 unmanned 50 caliber machine guns. Though Miller initially just handed White and the others ammunition, as he'd been trained to do, Miller eventually took up one of the guns himself. White later recalled that Doris Miller, quote, "had a good eye. One of the planes he was shooting at, and everybody else in the bay was shooting at, went down. He felt very pleased with that, and I don't blame him," unquote. For his part, Miller later said, quote, "It wasn't hard, I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine," unquote. After firing on the Japanese planes, Miller and the other men ran out of ammunition, and their ship, battered by torpedoes and taking on water, started to sink. They obeyed the order to abandon ship and made it off the doomed vessel alive. Others weren't so lucky. Of the 1,500 men serving aboard the USS West Virginia, 130 were killed and 52 were wounded. Historians have noted that Miller was one of the last men off the ship, and that he pulled a number of his fellow injured sailors out of the water, which, slicked with oil, had started to burn. As news of the attack on Pearl Harbor spread, so did stories about the heroism on display that day. Doris Miller's story, however, was almost lost to history. Newspapers dedicated just 2 lines to Miller, and they didn't even mention him by name. Instead, they referred to the bravery of a quote-unquote unnamed Negro messman hero. But the black press was determined to track down this unnamed Negro, and they did. Following his heroism at Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller's story may have been lost to time if it hadn't been for the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's leading black newspapers. The paper's staff believed that identifying the hero of Pearl Harbor and publicizing his story would help dispel stereotypes about how black men weren't capable of fighting in battle. But tracking down Miller was no easy feat. Though the paper sent its executive editor to the Naval Department, Navy staff said they had no idea who Miller was. There were a lot of black messmen in the Navy. It took a great deal of effort, but the Pittsburgh Courier was able to track Miller down. On March 14, 1942, the paper finally shared Miller's story with the nation. Miller became an instant celebrity in certain circles, and black Americans across the country clamored for some kind of official recognition from the Navy on his behalf. Miller was given a letter of commendation, but the black press demanded more. They believed that he deserved a medal. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, agreed. He believed that awarding Miller with a medal would be good for the Navy's image, and would counter the Navy's reputation that it was racist, though, of course, it was strictly segregated. In May 1942, Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the highest naval honor. In a photo of Miller distributed across the nation, the words, quote-unquote, above and beyond the call of duty were also proudly emblazoned. And Nimitz said, quote, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such a high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of Miller's race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts," unquote. Miller spent the rest of the year traveling across the country promoting war bonds. His image was used for Navy recruitment posters, and schools and parks across the nation were named in his honor. But even though he was seen as a hero, Miller still remained an active-duty serviceman, and as World War II escalated, he went on to serve in the Pacific aboard the USS Liscombe Bay. Meanwhile, Miller had been promoted to cook, 3rd class, but in the end still worked in the ship's galley. Tragically, Doris Miller was one of the 644 sailors who lost their lives after a Japanese torpedo sank the USS Liscombe Bay near the Makin Atoll on November 24, 1943, the deadliest sinking of a carrier in U.S. naval history. He was just 24 years old. But though Miller died young, he made a profound impact on American history. Many historians point to Doris Miller as the catalyst for the desegregation of America's armed forces. Even before he received the Navy Cross, the Navy had changed its policies and started to train black sailors for duties outside of making beds or doing laundry. And in 1948, 5 years after Miller died, President Harry Truman gave the order to desegregate the American military. Given his powerful legacy, many believe to this day that Doris Miller has still not been sufficiently honored for his actions. In addition to the Navy Cross, Miller has also been awarded the Purple Heart Medal, the American Defense Service Medal Fleet Clasp, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. In 2020, he also became the first enlisted sailor and the first black sailor to have a supercarrier named after him, the USS Doris Miller. But some have argued since the 1940s that Miller deserved the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. No medals of honor were awarded to Black Americans during World War I or World War II, though a handful have been awarded to Black soldiers since then, many of whom were given the medal posthumously. Historian Leroy Ramsey, who studied Miller's story, believes that he is the perfect candidate to receive this unparalleled honor. Ramsey said, quote, "Because Miller was black, this is what makes his heroism so outstanding. The first thing that the Congressional Medal of Honor asks is that you have to go beyond the call of duty. That phrase cannot be lost when it comes to Dory Miller. Here was a man who did what he was not allowed to do. Just manning that machine gun was going beyond the call of duty right there," unquote. Perhaps such an honor might keep Doris Miller's story and his heroism aboard the USS West Virginia from fading into history. Not only did Miller step up when his fellow sailors needed him, but his actions on that fateful day also helped change hearts and minds across the country when it came to Black Americans and their role in the U.S. military. Miller might say that he was just doing his duty, but his actions likely changed the course of American history.
Thanks for listening to History Uncovered. I'm History Uncovered's producer, Kit Westneat. If you like the show, help others find us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And be sure to follow the All That's Interesting and History Revealed pages on Facebook and Real History Uncovered on Instagram. Make sure you don't miss out on the new episodes and subscribe to the History Uncovered podcast. And keep up with our latest stories at allthat'sinteresting.com. If you have a question about the show or just want to say hi, feel free to call us at 929-526-3029 or email us at podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like Legends of the Old West and Redacted History. Until next time, keep exploring.